The next recommendation for creating a protective, predominantly plant-based diet is to limit red meat and avoid processed meat. Now, we need to clarify to people that red meat includes beef, lamb, and pork. It's surprising sometimes to me how many people don't realize that. The report finds a convincing link between red meat and colorectal cancer, as well as limited evidence linking it to other cancers. Red meat's higher heme iron content may increase risk, including formation of nitroso compounds within the gut, direct damage to colon cells, and generation of free radicals. Here's a forest plot that looks at some of the cohort studies in the expert report comparing colorectal cancer risk in highest versus lowest consumers of red meat. Studies to the right of the vertical line, labeled 1, indicate increased risk. And meta-analysis from the studies that had data regarding specific amounts of red meat consumed show a 29% increased risk for each 100 grams of red meat consumed daily. Now, one of the interesting things that is coming out is that there may be genetic differences in our risk from red meat. So while the recommendation is to eat no more than 18 ounces of red meat per week, what we're seeing, for example, in this French case control study, those who consumed red meat more than 5 times per week showed overall a 2.8 times greater incidence of colorectal cancer compared to those who ate less than that. However, for people who had slight changes from SNPs in the genes that encode cytochrome P450 phase 1 enzymes, these are the enzymes that activate carcinogens like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines, those people had risk from the same amount of higher consumption of red meat that drastically was associated with much higher odds of cancer. So again, the recommendation is to eat no more than 18 ounces of red meat per week. We may not all be impacted the same, but in overall population studies, the impact is clearly there. For people who want to eat red meat, this does seem to be a line of safety. We just do need to be clear that amount is important. Simply choosing lean cuts of these meats is not enough. When we talk about processed meats, that includes meats preserved by smoking, curing, salting, or preservatives. Here we see an even greater 21% increase in the risk of colorectal cancer for just 50 grams a day, with limited evidence of links to other cancers. Oh, I wanted to go back here, sorry. The increased risk with processed meats is clear, but which mechanisms are most important is still under study. Laboratory evidence shows that risk could come from nitroso compounds formed from ingested nitrite or nitrate and from carcinogens that are formed in smoking or curing. And of course, some risk may relate to carcinogens that are formed in high-temperature grilling and frying of these meats. We don't know if there's an interaction with heme or other components of red meat, since in population studies, the processed meat is primarily pork or beef-based product. So although it's possible that options like nitrate-free bacon or turkey hot dogs might pose lower risk, we really don't know. And that's why for now we advise limiting all of it. Now, we said that overweight is seen as one of the major risk factors for many cancers. Let's look at whether we can assume that following these guidelines for a mostly plant-based diet will automatically lead to a healthy weight. One of the expert report recommendations is not aimed directly at lower cancer risk, but is identified as a key strategy to lower risk by assisting weight control. The recommendation calls for avoiding sugary drinks because of their concentrated calorie content, which some research suggests seems to bypass our satiety mechanisms, so we don't compensate for those calories by eating less. The report also says limit consumption of energy-dense foods. The idea here is that foods that are high in water and fiber, like vegetables, fruits, and unprocessed grains, are much lower in calories than the same portion of foods that are high in fat or added sugar, like French fries, chips, and cookies. And we can see this in action in this observational study that followed 186 free-living women for 6 years. Now, they all tended to gain weight, unfortunately, but those with the most calorie-dense diets gained the most weight. You see here that we can see exactly why that happened, because even though they consumed about 25%, the high ED, high energy density group, consumed about 25% less food, that's the weight of the food in the left column, they still actually consumed about 225 calories more each day than the women who had low calorie density diets. The concept of calorie density can be really helpful when working with people who are frustrated with lack of weight loss, saying they just don't eat that much, as well as with those who complain of or are afraid of being hungry if they reduce calorie consumption. We can show them that with the choices, you can reduce calories and not necessarily reduce the amount of food. We do need to be cautious to avoid the all or nothing mentality when we talk with patients about this, though. This recommendation does not mean we need to avoid all high energy density foods. Healthy oils and nuts, for example, consumed in modest portions as part of a healthy diet, are not associated with weight gain. The message is to create eating habits that emphasize nutrient-rich foods to create an overall diet that's low in calorie density. In studies that evaluate the efficacy of reduced energy density to lower calorie consumption, it's clear that increasing fruits and vegetables is a key element for success, but this needs to be as substitutes for other foods that are more concentrated in calories. Now, foods low in energy density should help us feel full with fewer calories, and that leads to weight loss, right? Well, I know if you're looking at this, you already know where I'm going with this. We may be less full, or we may be more full on fewer calories, but studies show that for most people, feeling full doesn't keep us from eating more if there's large amounts of foods that are available. So strategies to lower calorie density are one tool that we can use to make it easier for people to avoid overeating. But they need to be combined with portion control and ways to avoid non-hunger eating, as well as physical activity to reach effective weight management. Now here's an example from a study at Penn State. The red bar that you see on the left shows calorie consumption when a group of women were provided with really more food than they needed to meet their energy needs. As in most studies, they did indeed eat more than they needed when they were given it. Now the orange bar next to it shows that reducing portion sizes 25% reduced calorie consumption. In the next bar, there was no change in portion size from the original amount given, but energy density was reduced 25% by adding more vegetables to mixed dishes and reducing fat content, and that reduced calorie consumption even further. But the yellow bar on the far right shows that when a 25% drop in portion size was combined with a 25% drop in calorie density, we see the greatest drop in calorie consumption. Here, it was 800 calories per day less than the calories in the bar on the left, and that occurred with no reported change in hunger or satisfaction. Now, this was a really small, short-term study, but I share it with you as a sort of model for an approach that I think makes sense. So these recommendations that we've just looked at really constitute the major pieces that we need to put together to create a diet that lowers cancer risk. But there are a few more pieces of the puzzle that we need to consider. The recommendation to limit salty foods and foods processed with salt aims to keep sodium intake less than 2,400 milligrams a day. High sodium intake is associated with a probable increase in stomach cancer risk that may occur by several potential mechanisms, including a potential interaction with H. pylori infection. One of our key messages here can be that people can use herbs and spices to flavor food instead of salt. That reduces sodium and adds yet another source of phytochemicals that may provide antioxidant and other anti-cancer effects. Perhaps you've had questions about the antioxidant and anti-cancer impact of spices. Turmeric is one that's currently receiving a lot of attention because of its content of curcumin, an anti-inflammatory compound that seems to beneficially influence genes that regulate cell proliferation and apoptosis. However, curcumin only makes up 2 to 8% of turmeric, which means that you would need to ingest about 4 teaspoons a day to get an amount of curcumin equivalent to what's being used in many laboratory studies. And when people talk about those ORAC scores showing the antioxidant power of herbs and spices compared to vegetables and fruits, do stop and look at the data. the USDA table that lists these ORAC scores is based on 100-gram amounts of food, and that's a reasonable serving for vegetables or fruits. But that would be equivalent to 1 to 2 cups of dried herbs. So while you may see some charts that list a teaspoon of dried oregano providing more antioxidant power than a half a cup of asparagus or strawberries, that amount is probably more than most of our patients would put in one serving of food. So the quarter teaspoon that's maybe more likely to be used still provides important antioxidants, but we have to remind people that it does not make up for the lack of healthy plant foods. So I'm not saying this to be discouraging. Herbs and spices add great value to a diet that's aimed at lower cancer risk. We can encourage it, and their compounds don't just add protection. Research now shows that they seem to act synergistically with compounds in other spices and whole plant foods. So it's a great thing. It's just an addition. It's not at the top and most important priority or place will have impact. When it comes to reducing sodium, we need to be clear that by far the largest proportion of our dietary intake comes from sodium added in processing. So a key message needs to be cutting back on high sodium processed foods. We can show people how they can find lower sodium varieties and how using less processed foods may actually help them eat better in a variety of ways, not only reducing sodium, but perhaps getting more whole grains in or eating less calorie-dense foods. Now, what about alcohol? The expert report says, if consumed at all, limit alcohol to no more than 2 drinks a day for men or 1 a day for women. The different limits relate to gender differences in alcohol metabolizing enzymes and body water content. Alcohol is convincingly linked to increased risk of cancers of the mouth, larynx, pharynx, esophagus, breast, both pre- and postmenopausal, and the colorectum in men, and probably the colorectal cancer in women and liver cancer. One of our key messages here, besides the significance of alcohol, needs to include how we define one drink. That's 5 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor. We all know that, but we need to remind people of that, and we need to point out to them how portion sizes have been increasing with these drinks just as they have with all the other foods we eat. So some people who would say they've had one drink may have had more alcohol than they realize. In general, this amount of alcohol offers a reasonable balance between cancer risk and heart disease benefit for those who choose to drink. Breast cancer risk is the challenge here, since several studies show that amounts even below this guideline of 1 drink a day are linked with some increase in risk. What advice do we give breast cancer survivors? These 3 relatively recent studies ask the question and report somewhat different answers. A nested case control study of survivors of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer found that going right up to or beyond the recommended max for women of 1 drink a day nearly doubled risk of recurrence. In the LACE study, which included all types of breast cancer, anything more than 3 or 4 drinks a week increased risk of recurrence, especially in postmenopausal or overweight women. Yet, when you look at the WELL study, they found no increase in breast cancer recurrence, and in fact a decrease in overall mortality with moderate alcohol, probably reflecting cardiovascular benefits. We clearly need to identify alcohol as a risk for breast cancer survivors, and each woman may respond differently based on her personal health risks and life values, and that's something we want to encourage them to discuss with their physician. The good news is that if we combine these basic recommendations, reach and maintain a healthy weight, get physical activity at least 30 minutes a day, eat an abundance and variety of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans, limit red meat and avoid processed meat, add and limit sodium and alcohol. According to the AICR policy report that was released last year, we can prevent about 1/3 of our most common cancers. Through these steps, diet can reduce DNA damage and enhance its repair, reduce chronic subclinical inflammation, reduce levels of hormones and growth factors that promote cell proliferation, promote epigenetic changes that reduce activation of carcinogens and turn on tumor suppressor genes, and support gut microbes that create a healthful environment in the colon that may have both anti-cancer and other kinds of benefits.